Voyer is an attorney. Our speaker tonight is an attorney based out of Vancouver, British Columbia, practicing in both the United States and Canada. Kellen is active in the video games community, including giving a highly recommended presentation at GDC, and has developed a deep understanding of publisher agreements, specifically publisher agreements for independent game developers, a topic that is very much of interest these days. And Kellen, the floor is yours.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Larry. So I guess the first question is, how many people were at GDC this year, all digitally, and saw this? Because this is going to be a rehash of the GDC presentation, but with some changes too, but also will be kind of giving a bit more commentary than GDC allows for, given their tight time frames. So let me just launch it up here. I'm allowing it. Okay, you can see my screen, I assume. Let me know if you can't.
We can. It is visible. You might want to move it to full screen mode.
Yeah, I'm getting there. I'm getting there.
Okay.
Don't worry. Can you get it? Yep. You see me now?
Yep, we've got
your. Can you guys hear me?
We've got your screen and your volume is on.
Yeah, you can hear me? Okay, good. Sorry, my screen went black for a second there. So awesome. All right, sorry, screen went black. All right, so this is a rehash, as I said, of my GDC presentation. Obvious here. And the focus on the GDC presentation was on publishing agreements and what the market is. So as you can see there, it's called Is This Publishing Agreement Fair? The mid-2020 Publishing Agreement Market Report. As Larry mentioned, who am I? I'm a video game lawyer with a practice focused on representing independent game studios. I'm here in Vancouver, Canada, but also I'm a California lawyer, and our firm is actually mostly US and Canadian lawyers. So we do New York law, Washington State law. We're kind of all over the US, but we're based here in Vancouver. And focusing on representing indie studios, I've kind of developed an unhealthy interest in looking at publishing agreements. And it's probably because they're just so poorly written. And so as part of this practice, I'm often reviewing and negotiating publishing agreements. So I get to see both sides of the table. And what I've noticed in these negotiations, being actively involved in them, is that independent developers are at a twofold informational disadvantage. First, developers don't really know what key publishing agreement terms mean. And that's a crucial problem. If you're going to be negotiating with a publisher and they're throwing around terms you're not familiar with, it's easy enough to agree to things that longer term you're going to regret. But the other informational disadvantage, and the focus of this presentation, and what's really the most material issue, is that developers don't really know what's standard and not standard. Really, their only approach is to ask industry friends. And I find this interesting because we work with a lot of startups as well. It's probably 50–60% of our business is tech sector startup clients. And in that industry, a lot of the big law firms actually publish quarterly financing round numbers. So people in the industry will know what's standard and what's not. If these kind of publications show on a quarterly basis what terms and particular financing documents are on the up, what terms are on the down, average financing amounts depending on stage of the company, all of those things. So in other industries related to tech, people know exactly what their peers are getting. But that's not what we have here. So what I wanted to do with this presentation was to kind of have people stop asking industry friends and to instead democratize publishing agreement data. So in this data, we should first talk about a bit the methodology. There's about 35 agreements now. It's 30 at the time of GDC. And what we did was we analyzed key data points within those agreements, about 7 of them. I'll talk about those in a minute. And we focused on independent game titles. So there aren't any AAA titles in this data at all. We wanted to focus it on indies, mostly because I think those are the people that need this kind of advice most. These are all platform deals as well. So it excludes deals where it's just for one particular platform or one particular region, because those deals often have different terms than all platform type deals. There's also no porting and no localization only deals in this. These agreements certainly have porting and they certainly have localization, but what they don't have is just porting or just localization. Again, those kind of deals are kind of specific for port or for localization, and the revenue share terms and the advanced terms are all much different because they're just so narrow in scope. Also, there's no mobile games in here. Mobile game financing, especially if we're talking about the freemium model, it's quite a bit different. But generally speaking, there aren't any mobile games in this data set. I'll say though that if it's not a freemium game and it's more just a traditional mobile game where someone pays a buck or two for it, you do see some similarities in the terms. And finally, there's few repeated publishers in the data set. Once you work in this industry enough, you know that there are a number of publishers, but you do see repeats on deals, and we only wanted to do repeats if the terms were quite different. So I didn't want the data set to be full of FinG deals or something like that to skew the data. So ultimately then the point of this is to remove the mystique behind these publishing agreements, because I think it is truly that, a mystique. A lot of people just don't know much about these agreements. And by making this data open, I think we can improve negotiations and we can improve publisher-developer relations as well. I think if someone's informed about terms, they feel much more comfortable engaging in that negotiation. What I find quite strange is that when we negotiate these deals, we as legal counsel are the ones that are doing the bulk of the negotiation with the publisher. But I think by improving the data knowledge and the knowledge of these terms, I think publishers can negotiate on their own behalf much more. And the other kind of benefit by making this data open is that if we don't like the market standard that's presented, then we can provide an impetus for change. If you don't like the numbers here, then push back and say no. So I think that's another great benefit of making this data open. So those 7 sections I mentioned, we're going to focus on. The first is the advance. And as we go through these, I'll define what each one is in case you're not familiar. The second is revenue share. The third is IP or intellectual property ownership. The fourth, sequels. Fifth, the term or the duration of the agreement, as in how long it lasts. Sixth is the audit right. And seventh is pricing. Now, there are some other key terms you might want to look at. A good example could be marketing clauses and who has a say in how the game's marketed. But those kind of details, at some point, there's just too many data points to look at. And there's also not consistency between all agreements on those points. So we thought to just limit to these 7, where we do see in most deals consistently their presence. So as I said, we'll start with the definitions for each of these terms. We'll then dive into the data and look at what we found. And then we'll provide some practical advice to help you in your negotiations with publishers in the future. So first, let's look at that advance. So the advance is the amount of money that you get from the publisher. Pretty simple. It's what a lot of people are focused on because that's the money they're going to use to finance the game development. And the thing a lot of people wonder about is what that average advance is. So the average advance amount we see is roughly $318,000, but that's a blended amount. So that includes both advance and no advance deals. And you might think no advance deals, what are those? They sound terrible. We'll talk a bit about them, but they're actually not that bad, as you'll see later on. Now, if you remove the no advance deals, you actually see a materially higher advance. It's $460,000. And since GDC, we've seen about 5 new agreements, maybe more. And we're seeing a number between 300 and 400,000 still as an average advance. We just haven't updated our data set yet. So these numbers are still somewhat holding true as we see more agreements. So diving into the data, the lowest advance we have in the data is $100,000. The highest advance at the time of GDC was $2 million. We've got a couple deals now that are 3 and 4, but they're usually under 10 million for sure on independent deals, just because the development costs aren't as high on an independent game, even with a bigger team. There are some exceptions with that on the indie game scene, but those deals are for titles that had huge success in the first round and they're doing a sequel. Maybe you'll see a higher advance, but by and large, at 2 to 3, maybe 4 mil is about the average number we see. But at the time of GDC, it was 2 mil. But not all deals have an advance. 18% of those deals didn't have an advance. And as I alluded to, having no advance may be a good thing. I wouldn't reject it outright. And there's a few reasons to consider why a no advance deal may be a positive. You'll see that reason later on when you look at how the advance connects to the revenue share. But let's look at how that advance is paid. In 68% of the deals, the advance was paid in multiple milestones. And what I mean by milestones are that the advance is paid based upon certain deliverables or accomplishments of the developer. Pretty common ones are, the vertical slice deliverable, alpha, beta. Those are all deliverable milestones that would need to be met before certain payments are made. And my recommendation is to really mind these definitions, focus on how the milestones are described. I find that a lot of people just focus on the money, they focus on the rev share, and they don't really have the energy to put together what those milestones are. And I'll find publishers too don't really care about putting together the milestones. But as a developer, you should really care about being clear on what those milestone definitions are. Because the more vague, the more broad they are, there's a better chance for the publisher to turn around and reject a deliverable and then reject that advance payment on that milestone because it's broad and gives them the leeway to do that. So the more specificity you can put into what those advance payment milestones are, the better. Obviously, if you just do it based off the passage of time, that's going to be quite easy. But if it is based off certain deliverables, be very clear as to what those are. I think that would help you in the longer run. So in the remaining of the deals, the 32%, the advance was paid in a lump sum. That's definitely on the rare side of things. And usually you see that if it's for a new platform. So if a publisher is also connected to a platform, let's say Humble or Amazon, they're launching a new streaming service, a new subscription model, those kind of groups might provide a non-recoupable advance in exchange for exclusivity. And that advance, as I said, would be non-recoupable. The advances usually aren't millions of dollars, usually a couple $100,000. But it's always, in my experience, connected to the launch of a new platform. So it's something to look into, because obviously a non-recoupable advance is a good thing, but always be careful with those because there's going to be an exclusivity period. And I find the other downside where you have this new platform type of publishing deal is that the publisher isn't often vested in helping you on other platforms, right? If someone's giving you an advance just to launch exclusive on their platform for a couple of months, and you give them publishing rights on other platforms, which I do see in a lot of cases, the publisher has their own platforms. They don't really care about the others too much. So keep that in mind. So as I said, does the advance have to be recouped? Yes, in 81% of the deals, it definitely has to be recouped. How is that advance recouped? Well, in 58% of the time, in 58% of the deals, the advance was recouped while the developer receives the revenue share. And what this means is that once the games are launched, both parties are receiving money, and at that time, the publisher is recouping the advance that they paid. And by recouping, I mean that they're getting paid back on it. You'll see in the revenue share terms, the revenue share terms change while that recoup is occurring, but it's good to know that in more than a majority of the deals, that advance was recouped while the developer was also receiving money. Whereas in 42% of the deals, the revenue share was paid to the developer only after a full recoup. And this is something that's concerning, because what it means is that the developer won't see a dollar until the publisher is fully repaid. And this is really, if you extrapolate it out to larger advance deals, really problematic. If you have a $2 million advance, and you're not going to see a dollar until a full recoup, you could have a game that doesn't do as well as you'd like, and you may never see a dollar. And if you've built a game and a studio around a game, and you counted on the game's revenue financing further DLC, financing new hires and a new title, and you have to fully recoup the publisher's advance before you see a dollar, your studio may not survive. So let's look at the practical advice here. The first, I think, is just don't agree to full recoup of the advance before that revenue share is paid. If you can have the advance recouped while both parties are receiving money, it's going to provide a lot more liquidity to your studio and de-risk things for you as a developer. And I think one's basis for making this argument to a publisher increases the further along you are in development. Now, we've had some clients that were 2 years into development before they did a deal with a publisher, and I think that in that case, the developer's already taken such a large risk in financing it for 2 years that they shouldn't be faced with a situation where they receive $0 potentially if the game isn't as successful. And we've had clients walk away from some pretty big publishers in the industry on that basis alone. So keep that in mind. And then to negotiate for clear milestone definitions as well, because where that advance is going to be paid in milestones or tranches, as we call it, if that's going to be the case, as it is on most deals, you want to have clear definitions. You don't want to be in a dispute with a publisher that you should be paid because you met the milestone and them to disagree, because you're always going to lose out in that case. The next one to look at is the revenue share. So revenue share, simple enough. It's the amount of money that the studio keeps versus the publisher keeping. And it's described almost always as a percentage of game proceeds to be paid to each party. And a common number you hear thrown around all the time is 50-50. 50% of the game proceeds are paid to the dev, 50% to the publisher. And the question is this a myth? Well, by and large, yes. We see 60% actually as the average revenue share paid to the developer. And we'll talk a bit more about how that 60% plays out, because it's not 60% on day one. So we'll show you how that plays out. But it was good to see in the data that we do have higher than a 50% number, and it's often 60% being paid to the developer. What was interesting to me to look into was whether or not receiving an advance impacts the revenue share. And we see that in the data. 71% of game proceeds were paid to the developer if there was no advance on the deal. So that goes to my point earlier on the topic of the advance, that the advance itself, if you can do a no advance deal, then you're going to receive a way higher revenue share, 71%, rather than a 60% or lower if you do have an advance. In fact, we just saw 2 this week, and the numbers were much higher than 71%. And you wonder, what kind of games are these? Well, these are often games that are nearing completion, and they're just looking for the publisher to help on the distribution side, the community management side, the marketing side. And so they're willing to sign a deal with a publisher because those are the things that they just don't have the capacity for, and the publisher will provide. But since the publisher has such lesser degree of risk here, because the game is near completion, there's going to be a much higher revenue share paid to the developer. But if there is an advance, you do see it dropping down. It's about 55%. That's paid to the developer if there is an advance. So you do see the existence of the advance impacting the rev share paid to the dev. What was more important or more interesting to me was, does that advance size impact the revenue share? Does that $100,000 developer advance have the same rev share terms as the $2 million advance? So we saw that if the advance was between 100 and 500K, and these are all US dollars, by the way, 55% of the revenue share was paid to the developer, versus if the advance was over 500,000, we had a 53% rev share being paid to the developer. So what this shows is that the size of the advance does not materially impact the revenue share. And that I thought was really interesting, because of what it turns out to be is that the getting of an advance, the obtaining of an advance in the first place, is a thing that impacts revenue share. And now you're seeing like 55%, well, I thought it was 60. Well, it's because often that percentage is not fixed. So is this percentage fixed? Well, in only 45% of the deals, the revenue share varied during the term. And this is something we'd like to see more of, because in those deals where you have the revenue share varying during the term, that's when you really start to see that 60% plus revenue share occurring. So how these deals work is, while the advance was recouped, 68% of the revenue was being paid to the publisher. But after that advance was recouped, a 60% revenue share was paid to the developer. So what we'd call this is kind of tranched or staggered revenue sharing, where while the publisher has the risk, while their advance is still being recouped, they're going to receive a higher revenue share. And I think that makes sense. But once their advance is recouped, they're really de-risked on the deal now. They've made back their money. So that's why you see that revenue share shifting to a higher percentage. But we really only see this 60% plus rev share being paid at any point to the dev in these staggered or tranched rev share deals. So if you just have one revenue share throughout a deal, those deals are more often than not 50%. I don't have the exact number, but off the top of my head, it is definitely more common to see 50-50 deals as just one level of revenue share. But even in deals that have multiple levels of revenue share being paid, while they may have 50-50 at one point, they also shift over to 60-40, 70-30, etc. And you can get quite complex with these structures if you want. We're just showing you the simple averages here. But you could do something like 60-40 in favor of publisher until recoup, then 50-50 until maybe a multiplier, 2x, 1.5x, then 60-40 until 2x, then 70-30 until 3x. We do see those on deals. Just requires you as a developer to know that you can do things like that. So the practical side of things is don't agree to a 50-50 revenue share. Instead, look at these different ways that you can decrease the risk for the publisher, but also de-risk things for you as a developer. And one thing to keep in mind is later in development, you're going to get a better revenue share. We see that in the numbers. And as I mentioned a moment ago, let's use those revenue share stages in the negotiation. The simplest one being your 60-40 to publisher until full recoup, then 60-40 to the developer. But you can stagger that out, right? As I mentioned, you can go 70-30 once the developer hits a certain multiplier, things like that. So keep in mind that you can get creative in ways that de-risk things for the publisher, but can give you way more money longer term. So let's move to that third section now, the IP ownership. IP, we mean intellectual property, and by that we mean ultimately who owns the game. IP is patent, copyright, trademark, but when you're looking at a video game, it's really copyright and trademark, the code itself, the characters, the look and feel of the game names. These are things that are being licensed to the publisher so that they can distribute the title. The developer owns the game 93% of the time in the deals we see. So my view is that if you see any agreement that says, hey, I'm the publisher and I'm going to own your game, I would reject that outright. It's just not common. It's incredibly uncommon. You see that 93% of the deals have the developer retaining ownership. Why would you want that? Well, if you don't own your own game, you lose control of that game. You can't get it back in all these publishing agreements we see. And often the publisher may even have a right to make sequels. So I think any of these clauses that give the ownership to the publisher outright is just a non-starter. The only time it makes sense is if you're doing it as a work for hire deal. We do see that if the publisher already owns a title and they're saying, hey, make us a sequel. We'll rev share with you on the sequel, but make it for us. Well, then that makes sense. But if it's your own game, it's your own IP, you should own it. And what about transfer on breach? And what I mean by that is if the developer breaches the terms of the agreement, should that game be owned by the publisher? And this is rare. It's only seen in 22% of the deals we surveyed. And I think it's great to see it's only 22%, but I want to see it in a lot fewer deals as well. I think it's really a very punitive clause, given how much time, effort, and blood, sweat, and tears goes into making games, that if you breach the agreement, especially for something minor, because that's often how it's framed, you could lose control of the game. And the thing is, too, it's always difficult to define what that breach is. I think you shouldn't agree to these clauses, but there's ways you can limit the risk. But a lot of the time, we see the breach as being something difficult to define, and it's something the publisher always has the upper hand on, because in most of the cases, the breach is defined by the publisher. The publisher says, hey, you didn't deliver the milestone. I made that determination twice, therefore I own the game. And even if they're acting as a bad actor, you as a smaller developer are probably not going to have the financial resources to sue and go after them to prove that you're right. So IP ownership should always be with the publisher, or with the developer, always with the developer, and you should really try and avoid any transfer of that IP should you be in breach of the agreement. So that brings me to that practical advice component on this section. Simply put, never give up IP rights. If the publisher does push for transfer on breach, try to find a way to address the underlying concerns, because really the publisher is concerned about you not meeting your obligations. And there's certain ways you could maybe de-risk that. You could, in a worst case scenario, have the publisher receive a higher revenue share in the case that you breach. But you should always have a number of options to cure that breach. And as I noted, be really clear as to what that breach is. But it's very rare anyway, so I think that should be your starting point in the negotiation. Push back and say no. Next up, the sequels clause. Sequel, as you know, it's the next game in a series. It's a very common clause. And in 68% of the agreements we saw, they granted some sort of sequel right or option to the publisher. And there's this distinction between right and option. I call it these, well, I'll describe what they each are, and you can kind of understand when you see them in the agreement, because they're not often phrased in the same consistent fashion. I consider it a right to negotiate. And if it's a right to negotiate, that's a good thing. And what I mean by right to negotiate is the parties, if the developer is making a sequel, have to meet for a period of 30 days and try to work out a deal. And if they can't, neither party's bound to the other. An option I view as a bad thing. An option I view as a clause that says the publisher has a right at their own election to publish the sequel, which means that there is no negotiation, there is no decision by the developer. It's just that the developer has to bring the sequel to the publisher, and the publisher gets to choose yes or no, I'm going to publish it. And that means that you're stuck in a relationship for future titles. And even if you've had a successful game with a publisher, if you feel that relationship hasn't worked, you're not loving something about that publisher, well, if it's an option, you're stuck there. And so that's why I like it to be this right to negotiate. And the other thing to consider is to never lock in sequel terms. We do see this somewhat rarely. I'd say maybe it's 5% of deals, maybe 10, where a publisher is locking in not just the right to negotiate a sequel or an option on a sequel. It's that the terms of the publishing agreement are going to be the same, if not near identical, to what the current publishing agreement is. And that sucks, because if you do a 50-50 deal on the basis that it's your first game, no one else is going to help you, and your next, and it's a success, and you're gonna have people clamoring for game 2 for the sequel, you don't want to be stuck on a 50-50 deal. You want to be shopping around and pushing people. So never lock in those sequel terms. And as an aside, but it kind of ties into sequels here, is to always shop your deal terms around. You don't see this as much in video game publishing as you should, I think. You do see this a lot in the startup sector, but once you get that first publishing agreement, don't mention the publisher to other people, but go shop it around to other publishers. Talk to others in the industry and say, look, do you want to publish this game? We've got an offer on the table for 70-30 or 60-40 or 50-50. We want to work with you. You think you can come to the table with some better terms. So in addition to just not locking in sequel terms, know that when you're negotiating that first publishing deal, go shop it around. On the practical side of things, for this sequels clause, don't be too concerned about it at all. It's very common, but push for a sequel right to negotiate and reject those sequel options, and obviously never lock in sequel terms. Next section, the term or the duration of the agreement. It's simple, how long the agreement lasts. It's a number of years, and sometimes renewal is possible. That average duration is about 6.5 years. With negotiation, we've seen only modest decreases in the term. So what that shows us is that publishers are loath to negotiate the term. And a fixed term is more common. We saw that in 64% of the deals we surveyed, than an automatic renewal. But watch that renewal duration. So some agreements have renewal as 5 years or something like that. Well, a lot of people, if they have a 5-year, or say use the average 6.5 year publishing agreement, and then at the 6 years in, you're probably going to forget about that deal, and you're going to forget that maybe it's going to renew for another 5 years or 3 years. You really want that renewal duration to be something short, probably a year at most. I wouldn't try for longer than 2 years, but be careful about that renewal duration. Another thing that's rare are perpetual terms. Only 38% of the deals had them. I think that's still way too many. And perpetual terms are really bad. That means, in my opinion, that means that the publisher gets to publish the game forever. And we've seen this go pretty bad for some clients that weren't working with lawyers before they came to us, because a lot of these publishing agreements that have perpetual terms have really broad descriptions of what constitutes the game. We've seen stuff talks about the game and starts to refer to the universe, the characters. That all kind of defines the environments, that defines the game. And it can start to really create problems, because if that's how broad the game is defined, it may actually prohibit you from doing sequels to the title. And that's actually some stuff we've had to deal with for some of our clients, where they had a perpetual term, but how the game was defined, it was so broad that if they wanted to do a new game, even if it was instead of a space game, a land-based title, they were worried that because it had the same kind of characters and same universe, it could be a problem. So, and the other problem I'd say for perpetual terms is if you want to do an HD or an upscaled version or any kind of game maintenance longer term, and the publisher stops supporting the game, or just is half-heartedly doing community management, well, it does nothing for your community reputation. If that publisher isn't supporting the title well at all, and it's buggy as hell, and they haven't done any updates to reflect the new operating system, it's going to look really bad on you as a studio. But if you have a perpetual term, you can't call that back. But the other thing is perpetual terms suck for sequels. This is a really inadvertent mistake where You say, fine, we'll give you a perpetual term, and hey, we'll give you a sequels clause. But that means that forever. If you're ever making a sequel, you have to go back to that publisher. And that's really going to suck if it's an option right rather than a right to negotiate. So really avoid perpetual terms. And if you have to sign one, think about what would happen if the publisher stops to support the game. Can you get the game back? You can try for that and watch it for sequels too. It should not apply to sequels. So practical advice here outside of what I just said, there's limited room for negotiation on the term as it concerns the duration of it, but never accept a perpetual term. Instead, negotiate for a longer term, I think, if you are going to have a perpetual term. I think 10 years should be the longest it needs to be, but I don't agree to a perpetual term. The next one is the audit right, which is a way to confirm that the amount of money paid to the developer from the publisher is correct. And this is standard. It's seen in 79% of the deals. And so what that clause would say is that once a year or something like that, the developer can audit the publisher's books to make sure that it's getting paid the right amount. And I'll give you a secret. Well, maybe I shouldn't. Watch the percentages. The secret is that a lot of these agreements are poorly written, and they say that if the publisher underpays by a percentage, they'll cover the costs of the audit. But that's a mistake, because if it's off by, let's say, $10, but that constitutes 5%, they'd have to pay for a $1,000 audit. So leave those in if you see it as a percentage, because it's often going to be a problem for the publisher. If I'm advising a publisher, I would not allow it to be written that way. But there's your little sneaky tip. Practically speaking, if an audit right is not there, you have to demand it. It's seen in near 80% of deals, so really push for that. Other thing to look at is pricing. Don't focus on price, focus on discounts. So by discounts, I mean set a date in the agreement that's the earliest at which a publisher can discount the title. What you don't want is a publisher that maybe is down on their luck and they see to drive revenue quick, and they say, you know what, we're going to discount this thing 3 months in. That could really tarnish your title's pricing strategy going forward. So you do want to agree on an earliest date by which it can be discounted. The same thing with bundling, right? You're first going to discount your title. Then bundling is often going to come much later in the development cycle, or the sales cycle, pardon me. So again, you don't want to bundle too early, because that can be detrimental to the product's image in the marketplace and its price. Practical advice here is negotiate for set dates for the discounts and for bundling, and usually these are different numbers. So I've gone through a lot of numbers here in 7 different sections. You're probably thinking, all right, so where do we go with this? What I wanted to do is give you kind of the average agreement in 2020. So you've developed an average game, good job. You signed an average publishing agreement. So you're going to have an average advance of $318,000. That advance is going to be paid out in milestones. The revenue share is going to be paid while the advance is recouped, which means that you're going to get money at the same time as the publisher is recouping that advance. 60% of the proceeds are going to be paid to the developer under kind of a tranched or staggered revenue share approach, where it varies based upon lower rev share while the advance is recouped, then switching to a higher number. The developer is going to own the IP. It's going to be about 6 years of duration. There is going to be an audit right, and the publisher is going to set the game pricing, but there's going to be restrictions on discounts and bundling. And by presenting this average agreement, obviously I'm providing historical insight into what your peers have accepted, but I also want to have the qualifier that if you don't like the average, change only happens if you as developers say no. So that's my contact information there, and thanks for listening.
I have to tell you, this was really, really excellent. And boy, I wish I had heard this presentation 20 years ago. I could have really, really benefited from it back then. Again, thank you so much for this. It is great. I'm going to open the floor up. Does anyone have any questions? Do you want to Grover just added 20 years ago. I wish I had heard him last year. So it's really great talk. One thing I did want to point out that is another one. So 2 points. First of all, for those who are fairly new in the industry, a recoupable advance, which is the money that is being given to you to complete the development game, do not use the words recoupable advance. Think of it, when you hear those words, think about it as an interest-free loan, because that is money that you're going to have to pay back at some time. That is money that you're going to recoup, assuming your sales are greater than the amount that's being advanced. So that's the first thing. One of the
Yep.
other kind of nebulous areas to watch out for in contracts, and I love the fact that you spoke so eloquently about the sequels and getting locked in, and things that really speak to the copyright of the game, of defining the universe, et cetera, and so forth. You very often see clauses that seem friendly under the title of right of first refusal. So you've signed a deal with the developer. When you get when you get ready to do the next deal, and you've shopped it around, maybe you had a unsatisfactory or dissatisfactory relationship with your original publisher. You want to go to someplace else. Well, the original publisher has the right of first refusal. The problem that comes up in there is that deals are very often apples to oranges. You're not getting a direct equivalent where you can say, oh, this person gave me more, either step up. So one might have a higher advance, but a lower percentage of payment. So it's very difficult to get those, and that's certainly a muddy area. Dustin asks, can you talk about a project that's modular, like the Walking Dead game? Would publishers still be interested in that?
Yeah, I think they definitely would still be interested in a modular game. I guess I haven't seen too many modular game deals because they're not as common, and they're often tied to kind of pre-existing IP, and whether you're talking about The Walking Dead or Sam and Max or something like that. But I think you could definitely do a modular title. And I think if I was doing one, I'd try to not lock in the rev share deal for the other modules. Like if you're going to do an episodic title, and it's a new title and there's some risk on the publisher side, sure, accept the crappier rev share on episode 1. But if you can renegotiate the rev share or maybe have it go up or down based upon some return to the publisher on game 1, I think you'll be in a better position. So maybe it's something you'd negotiate on future episodes. That's probably the easiest way to do it. But you could have some calculation as to return revenue generated equals a change in the rev share, something like that too.
Comment was great advice. Thanks. Any other questions at this point for Kellen?
It's free legal advice. Come on.
Absolutely. Could get you thrown out of the union. Dustin, you still working on a question there? Okay. Can you talk about what happens after the contract reaches its termination?
Yeah, no one really seems to think too much about that. Usually it just, all the rights revert back to the developer. And a lot of these agreements aren't very clear as to how that process will play out. If you think about it, you probably want to take control of the Steam page for that game, etc. So if you're smart, you try to build in a process for them assisting you with that transition. If there are physical units, though, there'll usually be a sell-off period. So I know it's a bit more rare on the indie side, but on the physical unit side, they'll say, well, we get 6 months to sell the remaining units we have in stock. The rev share will still apply, but that's a way for it to be fair for the publisher to move their remaining units. But otherwise, it should end after the transfer of the store page and whatnot.
We've got another great thanks on there. Any other questions, guys? I'm going to tell you. I think that that the questions that were largely answered in your presentation. I have never had a presentation on this topic that was anywhere near as complete as this.
I appreciate that. Well, I was going to say, Larry, there's one thing we're doing. Maybe I'll send it to you when we're done. We're actually launching a site in the next couple of months where all developers can contribute their own data anonymously. So we're going to try to build out this data set from our 35 plus deals into something way larger. And then that site's going to actually present changing averages all the time based off the data we get. So you'll be able to go to the site and see what the average rev share is, what the average advance is, and that'll change based on the data we get, which will be pretty cool.
So I did want to tell the group why you need good counsel. When I started in this business, it was not uncommon for indie developers to sign the deals without advice of an attorney.
Yeah.
We all tried to muddle our way through. So the first contract that I signed, the first contract that I brought in, and this was again 2001, what worked out great. The publisher was Take-Two.
Yep.
And it was a great deal all the way around. In fact, I'm still friends with all the people that were involved in the deal way back then. Different company for me now. Everyone's moved around, but that still worked out great. The next major publishing deal I signed was with a Canadian company. At the end of the story, and I'll tell you the punchline first, they declared bankruptcy and basically walked away with all the money that they had made, pretty much from my game. But that aside, while the deal was going on, I had not thought about minimum pricing and about bundling. So what this company did was they took 20,000 units of my game and they bartered them to another company that was under contract for 20,000 units of their game that they could then sell at full price and basically keep the money. And they played both ends against the middle. And it was something that I had never conceived of. The other thing that came up and bit me was they were allowed to deduct marketing costs without any definition or reasonableness of what their marketing costs were. And I paid for their entire marketing department during the year that the game was in development and sale.
Yeah, you really want, when you're, this is something I didn't get into in the presentation because it's not as much a data thing, but it's something I would love to see standardized in the industry, which would be the net revenue versus gross revenue calculation. So gross revenue is obviously the total amount the game makes, and then net revenue calculation is the publisher deducting certain agreed to expenses, and then from that net revenue number, they're giving you your 60-40 rev share or what have you. And I see a lot of times it's not clear as to what the deductible expenses are. And I think it's really important to set out, there is going to be marketing as a recoupable cost that's going to be deducted, to set a marketing budget that the parties agree to, because that way at least you can keep the costs under control. But to deal, like, you definitely want to exclude their general overhead and administrative expenses. It always pisses me off to see them just including their bookkeeper or their accounting costs in those. It's rare to see, but I feel like that's just, it's nickeling and diming, and it's hard to determine whether or not they're just doing that over the old organization or just your title. And it should just be part of their business costs in the same way you have to do your own bookkeeping.
Years ago, and again, this is my second career. Years ago, I was in the medical billing field, and I would often represent many clients that were in the same market and in the same sector of that market. So I would go in for a meeting with a payer representing 3, maybe 4 nursing homes. And I had no embarrassment about this, but I charged each of the nursing homes for the time that I spent in the meeting, because I would have spent the same amount of time, including travel to and from, that was allowable, because I would have spent the same amount of time, whether I was talking about a situation that impacted one or impacted all 4. That seemed reasonable to me. I will let you know that I was always embarrassed about that, because I was sure that my clients would not necessarily have agreed with me about that. I was kind of getting paid fourfold. Those were really good meetings. I liked those. Great. Do we have?
I think Dustin has one more.
Yep.
Yeah, I got one more for you.
Yeah, Justin, could you elaborate on that question a bit? And then I think I'll answer it.
Okay, just to elaborate. Okay, so I guess what I was looking at is what are the pros and cons of approaching or being approached by a larger publisher versus more of like a boutique? Some of the benefits and some of the caveats that you might have in those situations.
I'll say that I've seen some really sweet deals from like bigger publishers, Square Enix Collective, stuff like that. So you might think, well, the bigger the publisher, their terms are going to be more aggressive. I've seen probably more aggressive terms from smaller publishers than I have from the bigger ones. Maybe the bigger ones are just more comfortable with the risk given their financial size. That might be part of it. I think a great thing to look for in a publisher, though I think it's becoming quite rare now. I think Team 17 used to do this. I don't know if they do anymore. Is porting and localization in-house. For some time, these publishers that had that ability may not have set that as a recoupable expense, and that can really decrease the amount of money you have to repay because, of course, porting costs are quite high. Localization not as much, but definitely porting. So if you have a publisher that has that skill set in-house and they're not going to ask to recoup that cost, I think that's a great asset to have. So I think when you start to look at publishers, you're always going to be looking at what the rev share deals are and the advance. Those are things you're always going to look at. But if you're comparing two deals, I think you should also be looking at what the skill set is the publisher has in-house. Marketing skill set, obviously, as well. If they're going to be paying a third-party marketing company, it's going to increase your costs that have to be recouped, or their costs that have to be recouped as well. So, and then it goes to the point of what's the publisher doing if they don't have that marketing skill set in-house. Same with community management too. So I think the more costs the publisher can internalize, I think it's probably going to lead to more cohesive representation from them and help your game out while potentially lowering costs as well to the extent they're not recoupable.
Terrific. Thanks.
If we don't have any other questions, then I'm going to say thank you very much. Again, next couple of days, we'll get this up on YouTube. We will get a link over to you. We usually do a two-part process, send you over a link as private for you to review, and so you can burn the embarrassing negatives. But then after that, it will go live and it will be shared throughout the IGDA organization. Again, thank you very much, Kellen. This was excellent. Great information here.
No problem. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
Kellen.